For that. And in the meantime, let me introduce the next keynote speaker, and the person I keep saying, and I will keep saying, that it's the person without whom we probably wouldn't be here, because Hans and I met at one of the conferences organized by Marius Crisan in Timișoara, and that was 2015, and that's how it all started, really, because then we had all the ideas, but we met in Timișoara, and Marius is responsible for all this mess here. So let me just quickly introduce some of the biographical facts. Marius is well, actually, his PhD and has habilitation as well, which is another degree in this part of the globe. He's an associate professor and the teaching training department at West University of Timișoara in Romania, an editor of Dracula and an international perspective, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2017, coordinator of the special issue of Biblioteca Nova Bulletin Speculative Fiction and the Frontiers of the Possible in 2019, author of The Birth of the Dracula Myth, Bram Stoker's Transylvania in 2013.
This one, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Well done. And I've got distracted, so hold on a minute. And the impact of a myth, Dracula, the fictional representation of the Romanian space in 2013 again, and co-editor of the volume Beliefs and Behaviors in Education and Culture, Cultural Determinants of and Education. He was the manager of the research project, The Impacts of a Myth, Dracula, and the Image of Romania in British and American Literatures, 2011 to 2003. And many others, because Marius is very active, and we meet quite a lot at various conferences throughout the world, and it's always wonderful, not to mention that he's a wonderful singer, and I can't wait, and I hope that you're going to sing today, and if not in your presentation, then later on in the party. Marius, you're muted. And we can't hear you. Hold on a minute, maybe I'll try.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Magda. It's very kind of you to introduce me in such a flattering way. But I'm happy because this is somehow the result of my previous activities, as you have already said. But I mean, you are great organizers and you are doing it so well. So I really appreciate the work that you are doing. And I'm very happy to be here with you and with the other Dracula scholars and friends. So as I would like to say, I'm very happy to welcome you all from the heart of my home. And to be again together with you in the middle of a great family. A family which shares values of literature and which believes in the staying power of a never-ending myth. Which connects continents and generations, the myth of the immortal Dracula, as we all know. Can you please, Magda, I mean, are you projecting now my PPT?
Oh, sorry, no, I completely forgot.
Thank you so much. I'm asking again for your help. So, okay, thank you so much. So I think that the polyphonic character of the text has stimulated many ways of approaching Bram Stoker's vampire novel. And of the numerous critics which have discussed it, I think that we can distinguish some voices which have influenced the main directions in the field of Dracula studies. So let's see the next slide, please, which is relevant for my presentation. I think that one of the most prominent Dracula critics was Elizabeth Miller, Professor Emerita at Memorial University of Newfoundland. In my paper, I intend to refer to the role of the Canadian professor to the development of our research field and to share some personal reminiscences of Elizabeth Miller. I think that in the field of Dracula studies, Elizabeth Miller was a symbol of cohesion, and cohesion may be the strongest characteristic of an international community. My paper will also refer to the connection between Transylvania and the Dracula myth, and to the role of the Canadian professor in the analysis of this connection. And now I'm going to speak a bit, moving to the next slide, to the first half century of critical reception. We all know that even though today Bram Stoker's Dracula is one of the works of the literary canon with 125 years of existence, for almost half of that period, literary critics paid rather sporadic attention to this novel. There was some reviews in the English newspapers and magazines at the end of the 19th century, but insufficient critical attention was paid to the text until the 1970s. Much more attention was paid to the films inspired by the novel, some of them successful, others second-rate productions. Dracula was seen as a popular commercial book which inspired the film industry. Clive Latherdale explains this lack of interest in that period by the association between the novel and the films it inspired. I quote, "Low-budget films may have been equated in the academic mind with low-quality books," unquote, Dracula Unearthed, Clive Latherdale. When the book appeared in 1897, several reviews were published in numerous British newspapers and periodicals such as Athenaeum, The Bookman, The Daily Mail, the Pall Mall Gazette, The Spectator, The Telegraph, and so on and so forth. The review in Athenaeum in June 1896 presents the novel as, I quote, highly sensational, traversed by an immense amount of energy, a certain degree of imaginative faculty, and many ingenious and gruesome details. In London Spectator, the novel is presented as, I quote, a clever but cadaverous romance, in which Bram Stoker gives the impression of, I quote, of having deliberately laid himself out to eclipse all previous efforts on the domain of the horrible. Among the initial reactions to the publication of Dracula, special attention has to be paid to the review in British Weekly on the 1st of July 1897. After a summary and in an introduction to the novel in which James Todder states that, I quote, "It is certain that no other writer of our day could have produced so a marvelous book," unquote, the reviewer publishes an interview with Bram Stoker. It's the same interview that I was discussing with Hans today. Okay, as one can see in the quotations reproduced above, the initial reception of the novel moves between praises for the incontestable aesthetic value of the book and a moral reserve towards the cadaverous plot. A conclusion such as The Observer should not amaze us. I quote, "Notwithstanding the merits of the book, it is impossible to congratulate Mr. Stoker on this theme, which can but feel to be quite unworthy of his literary capabilities," unquote. Now, it is hard to imagine how Stoker's literary capabilities would have been analyzed today if he had not written this controversial novel. In the first part of the 20th century, the public success seems to surpass considerably the attention of literary criticism. After about half a year from its publication, Bram Stoker's novel was already translated into Hungarian. and the translation was published in January 1998. So, of course, the Hungarian translation was the first translation of Dracula. But the vampire novel also stimulated the creativity of its readers, since the Jewish and the Icelandic versions published at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th were actually adaptations of Stoker's novel, which included considerable changes in the plot and the structure of the text. The cinematic success was remarkable, and the first film based on the novel was, again, a Hungarian production. Dracula's Death in 1921, a film discovered by the Hungarian professor Farkas Jene, who I invited in a conference in Timișoara in 2013 to present this discovery and other discoveries relating to the Dracula myth, and to speak also about the connections between Romanian history and Hungarian history through this perspective, the Dracula myth. Then, Murnau's Nosferatu in 1922 and Todd Browning's Dracula in 1931 are other important films which opened an endless series of Dracula cinematic sequels. But, as I have already said, the attention of literary criticism before 1970s was rather occasional. In the supernatural in modern English fiction, 1917, Dorothy Scarborough considers Dracula, I quote, as the tensest, most dreadful modern story of vampirism. Although Montague Summers, the author of The Vampire, his kith as his kin, perceived Dracula as a very popular novel in 1928, yes, Summers considers the novel too prolix. H.P. Lovecraft mentions the novel in Supernatural Horror Literature, published in 1939, affirming that the Dracula, I quote, has become almost the standard modern exploitation of the frightful vampire myth. And now, moving to the next slide, I will speak about criticism in the 70s. So, as I have said, the sporadic character of the critical approaches on the Dracula myth may be associated with the little interest which literary criticism used to pay to the Gothic literature. In a lecture to the students of the West University of Timișoara on how to get published in English in April this year, Professor Clive Bloom explains that as a reader of horror fiction, he was disappointed to see that 1970s criticism paid no attention to crime fiction, the occult, or horror literature. And he took that shortage as an opportunity to set out new directions of studies focused on these genres. I quote, "I started to write books on the Gothic, a field which Christopher Frayling, David Punter, and myself pioneered in British universities as a recognized academic subject with its own discipline and methods of approach," unquote. As a result of this new approach, I quote again, new voices started to emerge and the new English literary history started to emerge with different traditions and energies, unquote. The three critics mentioned by Clive Bloom contributed considerably to the development of the Gothic through important books such as The Literature of Terror by David Punter, Vampires, Lord Byron to Count Dracula by Sir Christopher Frayling, or Clive Bloom's books such as Gothic Histories, The Taste for Terror, 1464 to the present. In the study, The Literature of Terror, David Punter synthesizes in a memorable phrase a Freudian reading of the narrative. And he says that Dracula is, I quote, the passion which never dies, endless desire of the unconscious for gratification, unquote. And now, moving to the next slide, I will refer to Dracula pioneers in the United States of America. Okay, so as I have already shown, the critics who doubted the aesthetic achievement of Stoker's book saw its ambiguity as a flaw. But beginning with the end of the 70s, literary critics see the openness of Dracula as a modern and valuable feature which hinders a unidirectional reading. One of the critics who opens this direction of studies is Carol Sam. It's her influential essay, Dracula, the Unseen Face in the Mirror, published in 1979. Sam shows the resemblance between Dracula and his hunters, arguing that the latter cannot accept that the vampire is the acknowledged self. Carol Sam shows that in spite of the fact that the narrators in Dracula always claim that they fight in the name of a high moral purpose, Stoker provides some clues to their unreliability and allows the reader to see the inconsistency between their beliefs and their actions. I like William Hughes' observation about the Dracula criticism, which is longer, but I make it shorter here. And William Hughes says, I quote, like the vampire, Dracula criticism defines time and chronology. I was thinking now of speaking about the directions in the field of Dracula studies, but I actually had 2 pages only with names and titles. That would have taken me at least 10 minutes reading names, titles, name, titles. So if you are interested in these directions and main works in the field of Dracula studies, please send me an email and I will send you a paper which includes this classification. Okay. Now I will move again to Professor Miller, who is the main topic of my discussion. So moving to the next slide, I would like to speak about the connection between the vampire Dracula and Voivode Vlad Țepeș. I remember that our colleague and friend Florin Nechita, in the interview that was a very nice interview, which was posted on our website, confessed. Do you remember, Magda? Florin confessed that he was a bit upset of this connection, that a national voivode, the symbol of the Romanian national values, was associated with this bloody fictional character. Okay, so let's speak now a bit this correction, and we will see that Elizabeth Miller has helped somehow Florin to change his perspective on the Dracula myth. Okay, so
but the problem was when I internalized this association, then I found Miller's work, and oh no, so it's not.
Okay, so now I am speaking
double
exactly
disappointment.
Yes, now Florin, I'm speaking exactly about this topic that concerns you. Okay, thank you so much, Florin. Okay, so now I would like to say, as you probably all know, that there is a whole tradition in Dracula criticism which identifies the vampire Dracula with the Wallachian prince Vlad the Impaler. One of the earliest studies in this direction is Basil Kirtley's Dracula, the Monastic Chronicles and Slavic Folklore, published in 1956. Besides the identification of Dracula with Vlad, Kirtley considers Arminius Vambéry, a famous Hungarian linguist and Orientalist scholar whom Stoker met in London, the model for Van Helsing. This was something which was already discussed during Hans's presentation, as we remember. Okay, so Arminius Vambéry as a model for Van Helsing. The connection between Dracula and Vlad is also developed in Grigore Nandriș's article, The Historical Dracula, the theme of his legend in the Western and in the Eastern Literatures of Europe, published in 1966. However, the most elaborate historical study of blood in relation to Count Dracula is the book written by Raymond McNally and Radu Florescu, In Search of Dracula, 1972, which carries on many of Kirtley's and Andrisch's hypotheses and proposes a female model for the vampire count, the bloody Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Besides the historical association, the works of Kirtley, Nandrich, McNally, and Florescu also make many references to the folkloric vampire. The theories of these writers, who base their analysis on the association between the fictional vampire and the awakened prince, were contested by Clive Letherdale and Elizabeth Miller in the 90s and after 2000. But historical association has had a great impact on the worldwide public. McNally and Florescu's books were bestsellers, and to a certain extent, they contributed significantly to the increased interest in Dracula studies. Now, moving to slide 7, I will speak about Stoker's Notes. We all know that Stoker's Notes were published by Robert Eyton-Bizang and Elizabeth Miller in 2008. Can you see the book? Yes, this is the printed version in 2008. Okay, so let's speak a bit about Bram Stoker's Notes on Dracula. Although literary criticism has paid much attention to the structure of the novel and to Stoker's biography and his literary character, it is obvious that Dracula is one of the novels which are continuously associated with popular fiction. Besides this, the book is very ambiguous, and this leaves an infinite space for interpretation and also for speculation. When speculation touches theoretical aspects, there can be no objection from the literary historian as long as factual realities are not counterfeited. But speculative argumentation, the case of Dracula and Bram Stoker, speculative argumentation has also touched subjects such as Stoker's life, the composition of Dracula, the historical models for the vampire count, and so on and so forth. This is why, when we discuss Stoker's biography and the phases of the construction of Dracula, one has to pay constant attention to the kind of secondary sources that he or she uses. In this context, I think that we should pay special attention to criticism which relies on Stoker's notes for Dracula in studying the origins of the novel. Stoker's notes, as we all know, are kept in Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. After the discovery of Stoker's work in Notes for Dracula, the attention of criticism moves from speculation about different historical or folkloric connections to an accurate analysis of the genesis of the novel. Christopher Frayling, Clive Letherdale, Elizabeth Miller were some of the authors who paid great attention to this aspect. And as I have already said, I mean, when I say this aspect, I refer to obviously to Bram Stoker's notes on Dracula. And yes, this is a facsimile edition, as you know, and as you can see, the edition published in 2008 is a facsimile edition. However, even before Elizabeth Miller, Clive Letherdale wrote about Bram Stoker's notes, and one of the first books which are dedicated to Stoker's notes is The Origins of Dracula, published in 1986. This is, I would say, a book focused on Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula. Sir Christopher Frayling also focuses on the sources for Dracula in the book Vampires, Lord Byron to Count Dracula, The chapter, The Genesis of Dracula, includes a selection of source material. But moving now to the next slide, while speaking about Bram Stoker's notes on Dracula, special attention should be paid to Elizabeth Miller's critical work. According to J.P. Ricken, I quote, Miller contributes to the re-evaluation of Stoker's accomplishment by challenging a range of misunderstanding and misrepresentations, especially concerning Stoker's sources and his life. And now if we move to the next slide, we can see some of the main works. These are books published or edited by Elizabeth Miller. Besides several articles on Dracula, Elizabeth Miller published, as you can see, several books on this topic. I'm not going to read the titles because you can see them. But besides these books, we should also mention here that in 1999, Miller started her editorial work on Journal of Dracula Studies. The volume Dictionary of Literary Biography 304 is one of the amplest works on Dracula, containing about 400 pages. The significant approaches on Stoker and his well novel. Another important book, as you can see, Dracula, Sense and Nonsense, is a tool which should not be overlooked in the study of Dracula, because as this field has been filled with conjecture and speculation, any novice needs to know which the trustful sources are. The one who approaches Dracula studies has to be careful, as there are almost 200 pages in which Miller finds plenty of errors, misunderstandings, and false stereotypes regarding Bram Stoker's novel. I think that Elizabeth Miller had an important role in the analysis of the connection between the Dracula myth and Transylvania. In Reflections on Dracula, Elizabeth Miller shows that the representation of Transylvania in contrast to England is derived from 19th century condescending British attitude often expressed in travel literature. In chapter 4 of the volume on Dracula for the Dictionary of Literary Biography, which is one of the most comprehensive books on this subject, Elizabeth Miller compares the references to Transylvanian history in the novel with Stoker's sources, and her emphases are on Major E.C. Johnson, William Wilkinson, Andrew F. Cross, and Maduchelis Magerland, who we know that were the main sources of Bram Stoker for his imagined Transylvania. Now, moving to the next slide, we can have a look at a famous page, the page which inspired Bram Stoker to change the name of his character from Count Vampire to Count Dracula. Miller shows that Stoker found the name Dracula in the book An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, published by William Wilkinson, when he read this book at the public library in Whitby in the summer of 1890. The first choice for his vampire was Count Vampire, but this was discarded when Stoker found the name of the Wallachian leader and its meaning in Romanian. According to the notes for the novel, all the information the Irish author had about the historical Dracula comes only from Wilkinson's book. Miller demonstrates that, contrary to popular opinion, Vlad was not the inspiration for Stoker's character, Count Dracula. If other researchers have speculated on other possible models for Dracula, Miller proves that there is no clear indication that Stoker had any person in mind. Following Miller's observation, one can notice that Stoker adds to Wilkinson's confusion between Dracula's and Stoker transforms a single historical figure into a clan. Because for Stoker, Dracula is not only a person, but a dynasty to which the vampire count belongs. And I quote, "We of the Dracula blood." When he speaks to Harker about the history of Transylvania, Count Dracula emphasizes the importance of his clan, whose members had an important role in the defeat of the Turks. Oh, however, I think that it was not the historical detail that made Stoker pay attention to this page of history, but a footnote in William Wilkinson's book in which it is explained that, I quote, "Dracula in the Wallachian language means devil." And this footnote is essential in the writing of the novel, and it determines the change of the main character's name, probably also the change of location from Styria to Transylvania. The statement that the novelist paid a great attention to this footnote is proved by the fact that he copied into his notes, "Dracula in Wallachian language means devil," whereas in the original text only the first letter is capitalized. In Stoker's notes, both Dracula and devil are written with all letters capitalized. And of course, this suggests that the two words are essential in the composition of the novel and that the vampire, Count, is the devil himself or a representative of the forces of evil. Dracula, as we all know, was the pseudonym of Voivode Vlad. If the information from Wilkinson rendered about is all that Stoker knew about Dracula, it means that he was not aware of the real name of the prince, neither of his historical nickname, Țepeș, the Impaler. So there is no evidence that Stoker knew about Vlad's atrocities or that he read the medieval German pamphlets in which the voivode's cruelty was described and exaggerated. In the important essay Filing for Divorce, Count Dracula versus Vlad Țepeș, Miller argues for a clear distinction between the two Draculas. Okay, so one more thing about this distinction. So Elizabeth Miller argues that Stoker cannot be accused of representing a page of Romanian history in an erroneous way because the historical Dracula and the fictional one are completely different characters. So now we can move on and speak about the way in which this hypothesis was accepted in the field of Dracula criticism. Okay, let's see if we can get to the next slide. Okay, so as Magdalena Grabias observes, Elizabeth Miller's perspective on the connection between the vampire and Voivode Dracula was largely embraced in the international academic world. And I quote, Anna Gemna, author of a monumental Polish book on Gothic literature, supports Miller's conclusion. However, at the same time, Magda Grabias notices that, I quote, nevertheless, a vast number of films and other texts of popular culture keep cultivating McNally and Florescu's theory and refuse to part with the idea of merging the character of Stoker's Dracula with Vlad the Impaler. So there are still many people who prefer to see this connection between the vampire and the voivode. And actually this connection has led to the production of numerous books, okay, such as Children of the Night, published by Dan Simmons in 1990s, or The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova, a successful novel published in 2004, a great success in American book market. So not to speak about many films, I think that you all agree that films such as Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992, such films were considerably influenced by this connection between the vampire and the voivode. So, however, now, if we move to the next slide, we have a link. Maybe we can, I don't know, shall we listen for 3 minutes to a short interview which Carol Senft took to Elizabeth Miller about the role of Radu Florescu, because as we have said, Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally promoted this connection between the voivode and the vampire. Let's see if the link works, and if it doesn't work, then I shall only the first 3 minutes would be necessary. Let's see if the link works. Yes, that's the interview.
Ms. Miller, Radu Florescu was a historian. He spent his career looking at these myths like Dracula. What do you think drew him to those stories?
Well, I think in the case of Dracula, it was as much as anything else, it was his love of his native land.
Ms. Miller, Radu Florescu was a historian. He spent his career looking at these myths like Dracula. What do you think drew him to those stories?
Well, I think in the case of Dracula, it was as much as anything else, it was his love of his native land, his land of origin, the land of his birth, Romania. And I think it bothered him that Romania was just being presented as Transylvania and vampires and so on. And when he discovered this connection with the real Dracula, that there actually was a Dracula and that he was a ruler and that he had fought the Turks, he was a brave leader in battle and so on and so forth, it kind of validated something for him about his country. It was more than just you could tell people now it was much more than just a land where Bram Stoker happened to stick a Count Dracula figure.
And so what did he tell people that he believed was the source of the story that Bram Stoker wrote about Dracula?
Well, Florescu, in the book In Search of Dracula, which came out in 1970, and he had a co-author, Professor Raymond McNally, as well, they posited the view that Bram Stoker had been so inspired by the research they had done on Vlad, that he had done on Vlad the Impaler, that he decided to base his vampire Count Dracula on him. Now, studies and debates and whatnot have discounted a fair amount of that theory, but certainly at the time it was quite groundbreaking, if you wish, if you were in this field of study. And Florescu and his co-author McNally were, for many, many years, the pillars, if you wish, of Dracula studies.
And you didn't agree with him about the Vlad the Impaler source either, did you?
No, not at all. No, we had many many debates and discussions, some of them just between the two of us and some of them in front of an audience about that. And always done, of course, in the spirit of true scholarship and no bitterness. In fact, Radu and I were the best of friends. And we'd have a major argument about something, and then we'd go off and have a drink together.
No, was he drawn to these myths because he liked these stories, or was it Romania that he wanted to talk about?
Well, both. I think it was more because of the connection with Romania. So another book he wrote was on the Pied Piper legend, and that sort of came from his Romanian roots as well, because there was a legend in Transylvania that when the Pied Piper led the children out of the German town, he led them into Transylvania. And so, again, it was something else that he made it able for him to project Romania to the world as something other than just the horror movies.
You spent some time with him debating all these things like Vlad the Impaler and going off to have a drink.
this was the most relevant part. Of course, if you like, you can listen to the whole interview. Yes, if we move to the next slide, we can see that Elizabeth Miller, the next slide would be the one which contains the reference of Elizabeth Miller to, yes, this one and the next one, okay? And the next slide is again, no, the previous one, the previous one, the previous one. Okay, yes, this is, I'm sorry. So yes, here it is a fragment in which we can see that Elizabeth Miller speaks about the role of Radu Florescu in promoting somehow the image of Voivode Vlad in an international context, and Miller says that McNally and Florescu's works somehow allowed Voivode Vlad to join the Count, who shares his nickname among the rank of immortals. Okay, and now if we move to the next slide, yes, I was reminded of another American scholar who wrote about Dracula and who was born in Transylvania, and I think that a feeling of nostalgia towards the native Romania is clearly expressed in the work of another Dracula scholar whose work, A Dream of Dracula, was published in the same year as McNally and Florescu's successful book. So, in 1972. Professor Leonard Woolf published several volumes on the Dracula myth and also edited and annotated editions of Bram Stoker's novel in 1975. The second chapter in Leonard Woolf's A Dream of Dracula opens with a touching remembrance of a day of childhood in Transylvania. Now let's move to the next slide and read from the next slide what the adult remembers. He remembers the scene which turned to silver and gray, to imposing shapes. He remembers mountains and valleys, brief, slim waterfalls gushing across the road cut into the stone. And he writes, my landscape, crystalline without lucidity, because children do not take imprints of the present, but live in it as if it were a succession of glimpses. My landscape, my homeland, the country of my birth, my Transylvania. And then, if we move to the next slide, we can see how the adult reacts when he sees his native land. And Leonard Woolf visits as an adult the region of his childhood. He has the feeling that there are three Transylvanias: the one of his childhood remembrance, the real region which he visits as a tourist, and the imaginary Transylvania created by Bram Stoker. And Woolf explains his argument and subjective choice. I quote, Stoker, who never visited, Stoker, who was never here, needed the Transylvania in his mind. He needed a truly dreadful place in which to lodge his towering, wicked, overwhelmingly lonely count. Utterly unembarrassed by his ignorance, he made his own Transylvania, and because it has a symbolic power beyond anything the real place has given, I prefer it to the one I see. And now I'm wondering, which Transylvania did Elizabeth Miller prefer? The one which she saw when she visited Romania in the 1990s and 2000s, or the imaginary one which she analyzed so well? And if we move to the next slide, we can have an answer to this question. In an interview taken by Angie McCaig in 1997, Elizabeth Miller said that she first visited Romania in 1994, taking a standard Dracula tour, and after that, she became part of the Transylvania Society of Dracula and chair of the TSD Canadian chapter. She writes here that the first trip was in 1994, and she writes about her connection with the Transylvania Society of Dracula, about her contribution to organizing the first World Dracula Congress in 1999, and she tells that as conclusion, her work in the field was recognized when she was invested as Baroness of the House of Dracula in a ceremony at Castle Dracula Hotel in the Borgo Pass. And the next slide can also tell us about what, if we move to the next slide, we can also see how Elizabeth Miller perceived Romania. So can we please move to the next slide? Yes, and Elizabeth Miller writes that she has been back to Romania several times. And she says, I have grown to love Romania and have expanded my interest beyond Dracula into the country's history, culture, and language. I especially enjoy Transylvania, which is renowned for its beautiful scenery. Okay, and now we can go on because I don't want to be late. Okay, so now, yes, we know that the vampire Dracula started to be better known in Romania after the fall of the communist regime in 1989. And in 1990s, Nicolae Păduraru, a former guide of the National Tourism Organization, had the initiative to encourage Dracula studies by connecting Romanian researchers in the field of folklore, history, and literary studies with foreign academics who approached the Dracula myth. And then Nicolae Păduraru founded the Transylvanian Society of Dracula in 1991, and there are many details about this in Duncan Light's book on Dracula tourism. Okay. According to Daniela Diaconescu, the first World Dracula Congress was one of the main achievements of TSD. And now I move to one of the Dracula symposium. As I say, the 1995 World Dracula Congress opened a series of international events carried out in Romania, and I had the chance to meet Professor Elizabeth Miller for the first time at one of the symposiums organized by the TSD. The symposium, entitled Dracula, Blurring the Boundaries Between Truth and Fiction, was held in May 2007 in Sighișoara. Carol Senf, Leslie Klinger, Jason Nolan, Mark Beneke were some of the internationally renowned Dracula scholars who presented papers in that symposium. And the symposium also gathered important voices of Romanian academia, such as the academicians Sabina Ispas and Sorin Comoroșan, or the Professor Silviu Angelescu. The film producer Michael Bailey Hughes was also there, and he was working at the time on a Dracula documentary and invited me to give an interview, which was later included in his documentary, Dracula, the Vampire and the Voivode. Okay, and if we move to the next slide, I will say a few words about the Dracula tour. So the symposium in Sighișoara was followed by Dracula tour in Transylvania, Moldavia, and Wallachia, organized by Nicolae Păduraru and Daniela Diaconescu. It was great that my PhD coordinator from the University of Turin, Professor Donatella Abate-Baden, came to Sighișoara and participated in this tour for several days. It was an unforgettable experience to visit Transylvania in this TSD trip, together with the Dracula scholars and other fans of the vampire myth. Of course, the trip included one night in Hotel Castel Dracula, located in the Borgo Pass and built as a replica of the castle imagined by Bram Stoker. And we had dinner next to Elizabeth Miller and her replica, because there is a painting of the Canadian professor exposed in the hall of the hotel. Now let's move to the next slide. Other memories of that tour. Yes, here is the film producer Hughes and Professor Carol Senf and Professor Esa Donatella Abate Baden, who coordinated my PhD thesis on Dracula. Okay, moving on, I would like to say that moving on and moving, of course, to the next slide, this one, I'd like to say that I met Professor Miller again in 2012 when I participated in several events in UK dedicated to Bram Stoker's centenary. It was an international conference organized by Catherine Wynne, attended by important names in our domain such as Elizabeth Miller, Dacre Stoker, Sir Christopher Frayling, Clive Bloom, Carol Senf, etc. And it was an unforgettable experience to follow together with such Dracula experts the steps of Dracula in Whitby. Then I saw how energetic Professor Miller was, in spite of her age, when I traveled in the same train with her from Hull to London, and she was arranging several details of the forthcoming activities. For instance, organized at the offices of Bite Back Publishing in London, the book launch, The Lost Journal of Dracula the Lost Journal of Bram Stoker, edited by Elizabeth Miller and Dacre Stoker, had gathered a large public and, of course, the editors, and also the Stoker family, Clive Latterdale, Clive Bloom, David Panther, William Hughes, Robert Aitin Bisang, and many others were there at that important book launch in London. And now, next slide, please. Bram Stoker Centenary Symposium, organized by St. George, University of Hertfordshire, included, besides several plenary sessions, a visit to Golders Green Crematorium, where the funeral urn of Bram Stoker is deposited. The main participants in this event were, again, Stoker family literary critics, such as Sir Christopher Frayling, Elizabeth Miller, William Hughes, St. George, members of Dracula Society, and, of course, the press. Another remarkable event was Bram Stoker Centenary celebration, organized by the Transylvania Society of Dracula. I apologize, no. It was organized by the Dracula Society, yes, so in London. Another remarkable event that I attended together with Professor Elizabeth Miller was Bram Stoker Centenary Celebration, organized by the Dracula Society, represented by Mrs. Julia Crook, and the Lyceum Theatre in London. And I should mention here that it was during the 2012 Stoker Centenary in London that I met Hans de Ros for the first time, and I received the dedication on his Dracula edition from Hans, hoping to meet you again in Romania. A hope which was fulfilled several times when our ways in the search of the legend met. The next slide, represents the visit to the crematorium and the urn of Bram Stoker. And now it's time to come to conclusions. Let's move to the next slide, please. So conclusions. Over the years, I was constantly in touch with Professor Miller, who offered me precious feedback anytime I needed. I was happy to have endorsements from her for the volumes I published on Dracula, and I was delighted to collaborate with her again at the 4th edition of the TSD Dracula World Congress in Dublin, 2016, when I shared with Elizabeth Miller and other prestigious colleagues and friends the tasks of the scientific committee. For me, Elizabeth Miller was and will always be an authentic Transylvanian, not only because she belonged to the Transylvanian Society of Dracula, but mainly because I associate her with the model of the Transylvanian intellectual, scrupulous and precise in research. In a personal manner, I associate Professor Miller with my teachers of Romanian language and literature in lower secondary school and in secondary school, who taught me how important precision is while discussing a literary text. Elizabeth Miller succeeded in the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s to build a paradigm in the field of Dracula studies based on precision and academic research rigor. As the Canadian professor demonstrated, many sensationalist and speculative elements affected the Dracula research before 1990s. The fact that a thorough distinction between proven facts and conjecture was encouraged led to the development of new directions in Dracula criticism. There is no doubt that the Dracula myth may stimulate people's imagination, and it is this stimulating power which keeps the myth alive. But literary criticism has to stick to the rigor characteristic to literary studies. And now I come to my last slide, my very last slide of this presentation. I think that the attention paid to Bram Stoker's notes on Dracula led to numerous discoveries, such as Hans de Ross's identification of the place of Castle Dracula on the mountaintop Izvorul in the Kalimani Mountains. But if such a discovery, like Hans's discovery, might have passed unobserved or not taken into account in an environment influenced by speculation and conjecture. Only after removing superficiality, new values may be developed. Besides the lesson of rigor, Elizabeth Miller also taught us how important passion and cohesion are. We need to put passion in our research in order to keep its results alive. And we need to stay together in order to make the literary values which we believe in as immortal as the story of Dracula. Thank you so much for your attention.
Magda, you are still muted. Thank you very much, Marius. It was a great presentation. Magda, you're still muted.
Thank you so much, Yuri.
Yes, forgive me because I had to do several things and also participants are asking questions, so I'm multitasking a bit. But Marius, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. And on the personal note, I'm very happy that you quoted me. I forgot that I wrote this text, to be honest. It's
Sometimes we have to write so much that we even forget what we wrote.
that was brilliant. But of course, the whole story is fascinating and precise, always with details and precision, as you said. It's important. And you always show it in your presentations as well. I just wanted to so congratulations, Marius. Sorry.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your attention, dear colleagues and friends. Thank you so much.
If there are any questions, then please, guys, speak up.
Well, I would just, I don't have a question, actually. I just want to congratulate calmly Marius, because since I began participating in these conferences, Marius' presentations are always extremely detailed and rich and enlighten us in lots of possibilities and researches that were made from Dracula. So it's always an honor and a pleasure to watch our presentations, Marius.
Thank you so much. And I'm also delighted to listen to your presentations and to talk to you. And who knows, maybe we'll have a Dracula conference in Brazil. Why not in the future?
High
Yeah,
time.
we are full of Brazilians this time. It's very, very interesting.
Thank you so much, Yuri.
Hi, Marius. Sorry.
Go on.
No, I just have a quick question. So you mentioned in the presentation that after the fall of the communist regime in Romania, that it enabled Romania to make more connections between the Dracula mythology and to use that. But I'm just kind of, I know it wasn't the topic of your presentation, but I am curious based on what you said, because I don't know a lot about, I know bits about I know generally about the nastiness of the Ceausescu regime, but I don't know a lot about, was like Dracula censored specifically during it?
Yes, Dracula was censored. Yes.
Okay.
The translation of the novel was published in 1991, if I'm not wrong. I have the book somewhere here. But
yeah, you're right. You're right. It's the same as in Poland.
I think, yes, I'm not sure. Was it 1990 or 1999? Let me show you the book. So this is the first edition. It was published in, only after the fall of the communist regime, Dracula was published in Romania. The Dracula translation. Was it the same in Poland, Magda?
Exactly, 1991, the first edition, and it was very short. There are cuts, like randomly cuts, fragments from the book.
Yeah.
I'm guessing that was the censorship in both countries was because of the religious imagery in the book. Is that right, or probably? Who knows?
Yeah, who knows exactly.
Yeah.
That's another thing that we need to research, to be honest, because I've been wondering about it on Polish translation, of course, but it looks like just the translator didn't have enough time.
Yes, and even in the Romanian edition, I can see that several fragments are not here. So they did not translate quite everything, and they made some changes, in the novel. It may happen with all translations, So we have a question from Nina, I think.
I just wanted to show how look the first translation into Polish of Dracula. It's so small.
It's very
too small. Too small.
1990. It's really small brochure. It's not even a book.
Yeah, and I think that Hans wanted to comment, or has he just disappeared?
Yes,
here
please.
Hans.
Also to congratulate Marius on this splendid overview. I think it's very important also to remember what individual people have accomplished, and especially Elizabeth has been so important in this field. So I'm very happy for this broad overview of the history. And as a question, I'd like to ask you, why do you think that movies, media, modifications of Dracula still try to connect Vlad the Impaler to the Count Dracula, although it has been deconstructed already by academics like Elizabeth? Why is this bond still so strong?
Because it belongs to popular culture.
Mm-hmm.
And we are fond of this story. We study it. We have spent so many years of our lives investigating this subject. But for the other people, it's just a topic of entertainment, so they are not interested in such details as we are.
Okay. Good.
That's the reason, and it's successful. And Hans, I was thinking of you. I mean, you said several times that it was Bram Stoker's Dracula movie 1992, which motivated you to approach the Dracula myth. So it was a movie which influenced you, and the first thing which really influenced you in approaching the Dracula myth was Coppola's film, wasn't it, Hans? So it was very important in your approach. It was your first step. It was your door to this topic. So that's the first level, to put it like this, you know.
Yeah, it was unscientific, but it was inspiring and moving. Okay, I understand.
So people like this connection, and actually they don't care. It's a story, it's a legend, it's something which attracts people, and they're not historians. They are just people who are tired after a day full of work and they want to relax. Because this is popular culture, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah, sure.
Elmar?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I especially enjoyed the portions about Dr. Elizabeth Miller, who I unfortunately never had the pleasure of knowing, but I almost felt like I did because you described her so vividly and you know, engagingly that I felt like I got a real sense of who she was. My question is, critically speaking, the only other books in the so-called literary canon of monsters, famous monsters that I could think of, even though they were decades apart from Dracula, are Gaston Leroux's Phantom of the Opera and, of course, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. In terms of those other two novels, how would you rank Dracula in terms of how it was critically received? Do you think it was received better than, worse than, or about the same as those other two books? And all three books are really regarded now as classics of the genre, and great works of literature, really.
Well, thank you so much for your comments and for this question as well. I mean, I think that in order to answer your question, I would go to a citation in the beginning of my presentation when I referred to Professor Clive Bloom's attitude towards literary criticism before 1970s. So literary criticism was not interested in the Gothic, okay? So Gothic was a rather sporadic approach for literary criticism. So that would motivate why masterpieces of Gothic literature were not connected with great pages of literary criticism. And there is one more thing. So in an interview which I took Professor Elizabeth Miller and I published in my book Romania and the fictional Dracula and the fictional representation of the Romanian space, which actually is a book in Romanian, yes. So I also published a book in Romanian, Dracula și reprezentarea ficțională a spațiului românesc. So in that book, I included a short interview with Dracula Miller in which she admitted that she approached the topic of Dracula in order to stimulate the students to participate actively in the classes of literature. So Gothic was brought in the field of literary studies in order to capture the attention of the young generation, in order to find something which is attractive to students, first of all, and this is why Gothic is successful for teenagers as well. But it was that period of the 1970s when the Gothic was systematically approached in literary criticism. That would be my answer. Thank you once again.
Thank you. That's very enlightening.
Thank you so much.
Okay, any more questions? I think that I stole sharing from Florin, by the way. Sorry about it.
No problem.